Bob, I want to speak a little bit about the Second Vatican Council and the influence it's going to have on the next 25 years of life in the Catholic Church. We recently celebrated the 25th anniversary of the close of the Council in 1965, and it was a time to reflect on the meaning and how far we've come. And I'm interested in also not only collecting those notions, but as a springboard to the future of how the Council can guide the Catholic Church into constructive directions. And I want to focus on the longest, and many people feel the most important document produced by the Council, that is the Church in the Modern World, commonly called by its two Latin names, Gaudium et Spes. So that when we start talking about this, the Church in the Modern World and the Council and so on, we probably ought to fill in a little bit of background here. When we're talking Council, we're 1962 to 65. I'm always reminding myself that for my collegians that I serve, that's ancient history. But for us, it was one of the high points, I suppose, of our lives as church members. It was a tremendous event in the history of the Church, called by Pope John the 23rd. He died early in the Council, and Pope Paul VI had to take over leadership of that council. And just to remind of how this document came to be, because it wasn't in the mix when the council started, but at one point Cardinal Sunens, major figure in the council, said, well, we're talking about all these internal matters, but we got to think externally as well. So we could divide our work up into the church within itself, the intramural questions, liturgy, how do we reform ourselves, and then how do we relate to the world. And out of that came this great document, The Church in the Modern World.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, that the tone of that document and the whole tone of approach that was, in essence, ordered by the Church for the Church is contained in the very happy blending of those first two words, Gaudium et Spes, joys and hopes. Now that's taken out of context, but joy and hope is a positive orientation, and I think it bespeaks the attitude of this document in the Church's approach to the world.
Yeah, Gaudium says joy, the joy that's involved now, and the hopes of the people. There's a famous sentence, I never can remember it exactly, but it's something like the joys and hopes of the world are to be more, draw the interest of the Catholic faithful even more. It's poorly said, and I can't, but the idea is that Christian people, because of their faith, are supposed to be more concerned about the world's problems, share more deeply in the joys and the hopes of all of the things that are going on in the world. I mean, it's really a wonderful kind of notion, and again, it launches us, Bob, right into a major idea. How does the Church relate to the world? That is what's behind all this. And just a little history on that. If we go back in from the time of the French Revolution onward, the Church was worried about modern trends. Too much freedom, too much autonomy, worried about that, summarized in the Syllabus of Errors in the 1860s by Pope Pius IX, which said no to almost every modern movement, including the freedom of the press and religious freedom and everything else, and so the Church absenting itself from whatever is going on. And then the marvelous turnaround in 1891 when Pope Leo XIII said, no, let's re-engage because these Catholic working people, among others, are being terribly exploited by the modern industrial system, so we better speak out and get into the ball game again. And so ever since 1891, we've made some attempt to say how, as Christians, do we live as both citizens of a country and as members of the Church. How does the Church as a whole relate to the world? That's what Gaudium et Spes, the Church in the Modern World, it really is all about in its essence. Then it gets more specific, but how do you work out this relationship? And I'm just saying one thing at this point, picking up on your point, that is that we are to share the joys and the sorrows, the joys and the hopes of the world as a whole.
That we are part, and hopefully we have something to contribute to that. And I think if there's any area of the Church's history and teaching, at least recent history and teaching, where there's such a clear dichotomy between what almost is expected, that in areas that touch on the social life of the Church, the social teachings of the Church, social justice, social systems, almost an extraordinarily liberal perspective, which is reflected in this document, as opposed to the tendency to be more conservative of the things that are within.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? Even in our current Pope.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
the current Pope makes some of the most radical statements about justice in the world, about economic systems that we're going to find anywhere. I mean, he makes these tremendous critiques of both communism, all totalitarian systems, but also at the same time of capitalism, and which he often calls liberal capitalism. And very radical kind of statements. There's no doubt about it. And his predecessor, Pope Paul VI, was even more so that way. Tremendous radical social teaching. So it is a strange mix that has occurred just within the last century.
Exactly. We're just coming on that century of the first social encyclical, the one that you referred to,
Rerum Novarum of Leo XIII. Yes. So that it is quite an interesting body of teaching. There's a book out now, Catholic Social Teaching, and it's subtitled Our Best Kept Secret. And I think that is really true. I mean, there's just not many people who know a lot about the Catholic social teaching. But if we know anything at all, I suppose it's probably more in relationship to this particular document, which is given this very, as you say, a very positive sense of the role of the Church in the modern world. And it picks up a very hopeful attitude. And I believe that's one of the reasons for its popularity. I think that people sense the mood of it, even if they didn't catch the specific teachings.
The mood, I think, is far more important, because some of the things that it treats of are already outdated or were not touched upon. But the mood and the attitude and the impetus and the thrust that says there is a need for us to be involved in the goods of this earth, the good things of this earth, and to infuse the Christian value message system into that, and to make an impact. That that we accept responsibility for the stewardship of the world, and it's in a variety of ways that are touched upon. Our stewardship of each other, our common solidarity with humanity, that says we have something to give and something to struggle with.
Yes, no doubt about it. When you use the word stewardship, it touched off in my mind the whole environmental question, which takes me back to the limitations of all of the Church's social teaching, this one included. You don't see that problem treated at any great length in this document, because it was not live at the time. We didn't have as great a sense of the environmental problem. So what you end up having to do with Catholic social teaching is see it as a dynamic, growing body of literature that continuously tries to take the gospel in its essence and its principles and apply it to the changing social scene. And that changing social scene is always ambiguous. It will be a mixture of grace and of sin, and some of those sins will be social sins. They'll get embedded in institutions and in structures, and they will have to be challenged. So a next great social encyclical, in fact it did happen later on, had to at least think about the environmental problem and try to apply Christian principles to solutions to that crisis that we currently have to face.
Yes, and I'm frankly at a loss to name that encyclical, but the one I'm thinking of is just recently issued within the last 5 years, that touches on the environment by the present Holy Father, John Paul II.
That's Solicitudo Rei Socialis.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
yes,
that is the one that.
It's excellent, and but it does treat of the contemporary scene that was not to the fore at the time of the writing of this document, the Church.
Right, which was finally promulgated. I think it was the day before the council ended in 1965, after enormous debate and discussion, and it turns out to be the longest document ever produced by any council, and to have probably a more positive tone than anyone has ever had, and to be really a sort of guiding us in our continuous reflection. One of the strengths, Bob, that I find in the document is its understanding of human existence. And early on in the document, it tries to say, well, who are we human beings? And that has become the center point of Catholic social thought. Start with the person. Those are our bishops in the economic pastoral. What do they say? How do you judge an economic system? What does it do for people, with people? How does it treat people? Will it enhance human life? That's the way you judge an economic system. So the person is put in the center. Now, it's always a question, well, what does this person look like that you're putting in the center? What are their characteristics? And I'd suggest they've done a good job of two things. They've seen that this person is an individual with freedom and with rights. The person has rights. and right to employment, even a right to make a living, rights to happiness, and so on. So there's that individual sense, but at the same time, balancing, encompassing it is that we are social creatures. We are interdependent. We live in environments, contexts, families. We participate in labor unions, in corporations, and in life of a nation, finally in the life of the whole global family. We are, in other words, interdependent creatures. We have independence and autonomy, rights, but we also have this social character. And that it's a beautiful, and it's often beautifully said by the council document. We are the crown of creation, and called by God to live out the energies that He has put within us. So I find that to be very helpful understanding, because if you get your anthropology, that is your understanding of human nature, wrong, you're going to be messed up forever, as we see in Marxism. I mean, Marxism doesn't work because it doesn't understand human nature. That's where it went wrong, right at the beginning. And I think the Council's got it right, and that's why it's got a chance to make an impact in the world.
And I think that the statement of that came in this document was not altogether new, but the manner in which it approached it, the manner in which we spoke of the dignity of individuals and their rights and their freedoms, and yet their, as you pointed out, their interdependence, was a re-emphasis of what had been said in those isolated documents, but now came to the fore and gave a thrust that says, all right, now let's go from here. How do we play this out?
The document was very influenced by the writings of Pope John the 23rd, especially his Pacem in Terris, the encyclical he issued in 1963, shortly before his death, and which served as a basis for much of what they said in this document. So the hand of John the 23rd is very clear in this document, and again, that's why it becomes, has this optimistic tone about the world, and sees the Church as entering in as a dialogue partner. Before that, in Catholic social thought, very often it was a matter of the Church sort of dictating. We got the answer, and we know how this is supposed to work. But then, with Pope John, with his more tolerant, open attitude that he had, he wanted to be a partner. He wanted to work with the people in the world. And so it has positive things to say about what's going on in the world. In fact, the sense is there the Church can not only instruct the world, but also learns from the world. We learn from the world of science. We learn from the world of culture. And I think that is a great step forward for the Catholic community.
Oh, indeed. I think we, for many, many years, in a variety of ways, presumed that Christianity, as we understood it, was coextensive with a Western, almost Frankish culture that we sought to superimpose with religion on any other culture of the world. And it didn't work. And we finally said, we need to listen. I think they use the term the signs of the times.
Oh, yes, let's get on that. Yeah, that's good.
Read the signs of the times, but if you're going to do that, you'd better be able to understand, first of all, the culture of the individuals with whom you're entering into dialogue or partnership, and not try to change their culture, but to learn from it, to be enriched by it. And that's part of, I think, probably almost the first step in reading the signs of the times. What's going on in this world? It's not the world we construct in our mind, the ideal world. We have a real world, and we need to read the signs and be aware of them.
Don't you think, Bob, as we look in the next 25 years, that will be one of the keys, that if the Church is going to continue to grow and live out the progressive spirit of the Council, that the Church has to continue to read the signs of the times and to become better at it, to catch the cultural trends, to see both the good and the negative as well. I mean, we have to be aware of social sin and the destructive institutions that exist in society. So by reading the sign of the times sees both grace and sin at work in the world. And I think we're going to have to become better at that and more responsive to it. We can't just make these great declarations in isolation anymore. And of course, our bishops in the United States have led the way in this, in our economics pastoral and the peace pastoral, where they really have done this dialoguing, and as a result have brought more people on board to accept or to at least think seriously about the social teaching they've given forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there has been that openness to listening, the hearings, I guess, that really went on in the formation of those two documents, but also the general attitude of let us listen to our counterparts, be they in the Marxist camp of yore, or in the liberation theology, the oppressions that are being experienced in South America, the need to express their kind of reality. Let's listen and then make some judgments in dialogue.
Right. We listen in light of the gospel, don't we? We don't listen just like a secular sociologist would, but when we try to read the signs of the times, we are already bringing a faith perspective to it.
Yeah,
so it alerts us to certain things that maybe the secular sociologist might miss.
Well, I think you could become just a statistician and simply reporting, well, trends are moving this way.
Yeah, right.
Well, okay, I need to know that trends are moving that way, but I'd like to listen to it or hear it or react to it in terms of fidelity to the gospel. That, I see that trends are moving. Let's try to find out why, and is there a validity to this, or is there a corrective that needs to be remembered in terms of our value system?
There's almost a spirit, Bob, that we end up seeing within the church. In number 62, the document says that the faithful and both the priests and the lay people possess what they call a lawful freedom of inquiry and of thought, and the freedom to express their minds humbly and courageously about those matters in which they enjoy competence. So it's interesting that it's promoting this sort of free inquiry in the church, the thinking through the faith, people who have expertise bringing it forth. Again, I think if in our parishes we're going to thrive in the next 25 years with the spirit of this document, and we keep getting back to that, we will learn to take seriously the people who have expertise in our parishes, who know things, who will listen to them. They'll help us to shape and mold the Christian message and make our parishes really more viable entities.
I think there are so many areas where that's apparent. We need to listen carefully to those who have expertise in the areas of human life and genetics, not just presume that we know all the answers. Granted, I think that in the absence of clarity of information, there are certain presuppositions with which one works. But I think we need to be open to those people who have expertise. The Church should have paid attention to the scientific community back in the Middle Ages. We wouldn't have gotten into so many problems over Galileo. Yes. That's just kind of an insight that's or a model from the past that says what to do now. Not everybody who puts himself up as an expert is one. We have to be a little discerning there.
That's right. You know, that sort of raises a caution in that we've seen about the reactions to this document. I think as time has gone on, we've seen more and more criticisms of Gaudium et Spes, and they have come from the liberation theologians and from the people who are more attuned to oppression in the world and to unjust structures. So I think the criticism runs something like this, that this whole document is really written by Europeans, that they had the major hand in it, and that if it had been written more with the third world in mind, with developing countries, it would have looked differently. That it would not have been quite the optimistic spirit that it has, and I'm distinguishing hope and optimism here, but optimism about where the world is going. It would have a greater sense of the ambiguity of secular society, have a greater sense of how many people are oppressed and what we need to do to try to help them. And I think that that limitation of the document was recognized by Pope Paul VI, because when he wrote some of his social encyclicals, a call to action, for example, or Populorum Progressio, he really did get more into the mind of the developing world. And he said, well, it isn't just, we in the West who have things done so well and are so affluent, but we must be more aware of these people who don't have the goods of this world, and how does the gospel speak to them? So I'm just saying there's a criticism of the document from the liberation aspect that I think we have to take into consideration in the next 25 years. So when you're saying listen to the signs of the times, we must listen in the United States to minorities who can't seem to break out of the hellish circle of poverty. We've got to listen to the feminists who feel as though their rights are not being respected. We have to hear that, those cries of the poor and the oppressed, if we're going to be effective, I think, in this relating the church to the world. Just to play that out, in the United States right now, 3/4 of the Catholic population has made it. Affluent, middle class, functioning pretty well. 1/4 have not. largely Hispanic today. That's the makeup of our church in the United States. We have to hear the voices of the 1/4 as well.
I think you're absolutely correct in terms of the need to listen. I guess I would say that I'm not quite so sympathetic to a critical approach to Gaudium et Spes as is articulate. It's not the last word.
Mm-hmm.
I think it created the attitude that enabled the liberation theologians to be able to speak and to bring this to the consciousness. I think we now need to do better listening to that. I don't want to be negative on the document. Perhaps it is a bit more optimistic, and I think you're correct. It was written from a first world mentality. There were better signs there. Did not take into account. But it gave a thrust. It gave a legitimacy. And the social encyclicals and the other documents that have come from a variety of places, and the theological work that has been done, and what is happening now on local levels, at least our alertness to, awareness of difficulties and problems to which we have not been attentive and must now draw our attention. I think they receive their impetus here. And so with all its limitations, let's go on.
Yeah, your point is well taken, and that sets up, our task for the next 25 years, it seems to me, in our parishes and dealing with our people. And I'd go back, it seems to me, we got to go back to the most fundamental notions of the document to capitalize on its strengths. We have to help our people to see that we are social creatures. That is, to fight the individualism that we find in our world today, especially in our society in the United States. That we have this rampant individualism, do your own thing, you're going to look out for number one, you're going to rise up the economic ladder, and that's going to be your source of happiness. All the thing that we know so prominently in our culture. So we have to keep hammering away at other things that the document is good at. We are social creatures, we're interdependent, we must be concerned with the common good, with the public good, with the social order. And so our people, we have to prepare our people for that. We probably need more homilies on social questions, more guidance for people in their everyday life, like a spirituality of work or a spirituality for family life. We're going to just have to do a better job of that in the next 25 years. We have to help our people to see that the joys and the sorrows of the world are their concern as well.
And that we're part of them.
Yeah.
Even though we may be in a far better affluent situation in terms of material goods, we may be impoverishing ourselves in a whole other dimension.
No.
And to bring that home, and that's a tough doctrine to hear. I don't like to hear that,
Sure.
particularly because it really means a re-examination of my whole very comfortable lifestyle. I'm not sure I want to hear that. That's why I think, in a sense, this has, as you said in the very beginning, become one of the best kept secrets of Vatican II and of Catholic teaching in general.
No.
Our whole approach is it is liberal, it is radical, it's demanding, and it really takes you back to the cross.
It does, yeah. That's right. And so part of the critique you get here is of something like consumerism, for example, that is rampant in the United States. The idea that, you have to have more, that worth is connected with acquisition of property or status or education or anything like that. And what the document, I think, gives us is an understanding of human nature that says, no, we're valuable in ourselves, we're made in God's image, we're worthwhile for just who we are, apart from what we've accomplished or what we've acquired over a period of years. That will be a valuable message to get out.
That's a very valuable and very tough one to get out.
It is.
Because the person who's feeling anything but gracious and good about himself or herself is really going to struggle with that.
Let's just take at least note, Bob, of the second part of the document, because it is divided into two parts, and the first chapter in the second part deals with marriage and family life, goes on to talk about culture, eventually talks about international relationships. So it takes up the major social questions of our time, and again, it gives us guidance in all of this. It has strong statements against war. Reminds us that that violence is not the way to solve problems. It suggests that in the modern world it's very questionable about how moral all-out war could ever be.
Totally.
So it really it's helpful with that. And I must say it's one of the more sustained treatments we get of marriage and family life among the social documents, at least in the Catholic Church. So it does not only give us general principles, but attempts to take up some of those particular topics as well. And I suppose marriage would be a good example. And we might as well get out here that one of the things the document didn't do was treat birth control. And that's often been a criticism. The Pope Paul VI took it off the agenda, said that he would solve it himself and not let the bishops discuss that question, and thus he did, and gave his own opinion on it in 1968 in Humanae Vitae, the famous birth control encyclical. But the natural place to have treated that would have been in Part 2, Chapter 1, dealing with marriage and family life, and the bishops were told really that they could not do that. Some of the bishops were not happy about that at the time, feeling that a large-scale debate would have been helpful for the Church as a whole. But we need to at least, it seems to me, note that lack in the document.
And retrospectively, yes, I think there are many who would agree with that it would have been a fuller thing. And yet, even with those limitations, even though there wasn't that, there was still a movement forward in the understanding of Christian married love.
You might just detail that a little bit. Go ahead.
Not being simply procreative, but for the mutual enhancement of the lives of the two people involved in it. And it put responsible parenthood in the foreground. And I think those are extremely valuable steps forward, and even though there may have been reactionary stances as a result of Humanae Vitae, those two principles have not been lost, and they were a valuable contribution. Would have been enriched had it been a larger.
Yes, and they refused to use the language saying that procreation was the prior sort of reason, and that it sort of put them on a par, exactly. Procreation and fostering of love among the spouses. Well, Bob, we're dealing with one of the longest documents produced, and there's so much to say about it, but I think you've captured it by insisting on the spirit of the document. It's open, it's optimistic, and it moves us to continue to think about our place in the world. And if we can do that in the next 25 years, the document will really have been one of the more valuable things the Second Vatican Council produced, because it'll help us to think of who we are and how will we live out the gospel in the real world.